Montford experiment. My name is Jim Hutchinson. Most people call me Hutch, even in my professional life. My family-owned business is as a concrete contractor, and we perform work for a variety of private and federal clients. One such client is the Texas State Department of Corrections. It was work at one of their detention centers that got me interested in volunteering at a facility. About 5 years back, we were installing a parking lot at the Montford Adult Correctional Institute in Lubbock. It is also known by its more appropriate name, the Montford Psychiatric Unit, as all of the inmates have been diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder or other. As my men were doing the preparation, concrete placement and finishing over a number of weeks, I used to watch people walking in and out of the front doors of the facility. It was depressing. Always the same scene. There would be inmates in orange and white striped jumpsuits. Trustees outside the doors sweeping the front steps and picking up trash, cigarette butts, gum wrappers, etc. But mostly sweeping. Always sweeping. All day long. Must have been the cleanest set of stairs in all of Texas. I suppose it was a treat for them though. After exhibiting good behaviour for a while, they were actually allowed outside the unit. I have seen the conditions inside, and boy, I would not want to be locked up in there for too long. Still, the looks on their faces, blank stares, slack jaw, sweating in the 100-degree sun, as I said. Very depressing. I had a lot of experience with mental disorders, being diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder. And being a recovering alcoholic, I had found help and comfort through proper medical care and support groups. And I wished that there was some way I could pass that on to these poor men. Then one day, I discovered how I could. The guards at the front desk came to know me and some of my supervisory crew. They did not mind if we occasionally came inside the lobby to get out of the sun and use the restrooms or buy soda from one of the machines in the waiting room. I was sitting in a chair one day, holding a cold bottle of Big Red to my forehead, when I overheard two women talking nearby. They were well dressed and obviously not there as visitors. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the few words I could hear caught my attention. Apparently they were volunteers at the prison, bringing the word of the Lord to the inmates confined inside. I told them how much I admired their work, and how I had a desire to help in a similar way. And so they suggested that I apply for a petition as a pastoral counsellor in the unit. Long story short, I did just that. I had to go through some training, what I could and could not bring to the facility, what I could and could not say to the inmates, never share personal information or build friendships, and how to act when inside general population walking and talking amongst the convicts. It was all pretty much common sense. For the first 8 weeks or so, I had to be escorted in and out of the unit proper. I would arrive, place my boots, keys, wallet and such on a conveyor belt, turn over my briefcase for inspection and walk through a metal detector. Then one of the guards at the entrance to general population would call up to the counsellor's office and someone would come down to get me. During the 8 weeks I was fingerprinted, interviewed and a federal background check was run on me. Eventually I was given a badge of my own and no longer needed an escort. I learnt many things in my first 3 months of volunteering. Bibles were like currency to the inmates, reading material to overcome boredom. Pencils were not allowed in the cell blocks, so the men loved meeting with me to write journals. They spent most of their time doodling ideas for tattoos. The really sick ones, the mentals, as the guards cruelly referred to them, were not allowed into the general pop and looked forward to my visits. Most of all, I learned how easy it was to get in and out of the prison. Not that I would ever have done it, but I marvelled at the fact that, given the right inclination, a body could make a mint smuggling in cigarettes or booze stuffed in their socks. I followed the same ritual every evening that I visited. I would park in the lot, walk past the trustees who swept the front steps. Wow, did they ever stink! And enter the facility. The guards got to know me and grew comfortable with my visits. They began by waving me through the detector without having to remove my boots or open my briefcase, and eventually started letting me avoid the security check altogether. Next, I was allowed to bypass the desk and go directly behind to a filing cabinet, where I could retrieve my badge. I wasn't permitted to take it outside the prison. Then I get buzzed through an unremarkable metal door and walked down a long, unadorned hallway. At the end of the hall was where the genuine security measures began. The hallway terminated at another door, this one made of double layers of thick, cloudy, butterproof glass supported within a frame of 4" by 4" square steel tubes. I would approach and stand under a camera mounted above the door, lifting both my face and the badge toward the camera in order for the guards inside to verify my identity. Once done, the door would slide open, allowing me to step inside an airlock of sorts, and the door would slide shut behind me. The compartment was a triangular room with 3 doors, all similar, and a window set into the side. The guards in control of the doors sat behind the window and would control the doors, opening only one at a time. I came to call them doors number 1, 2 and 3. Sort of like the game show Let's Make a Deal. I always entered through door number 1, and then was allowed to pass through door number 2 into the prison's general population. From the start, I would always gaze at number 3 and wonder what was behind it, as it was the only door with darkened glass. Since no more than one door was ever open at a time, I never got a peek inside. During my orientation, I was told that the prison's infirmary was back there. When door number 2 opened, the stench was overpowering. No matter how many times you would enter the block, you never did get used to it. Mostly it was the reek of urine, but was accompanied by an underlying sweet citrus smell as a result of the cleaning fluid that they ineffectively used to mop down the halls. Inmates ambled up and down the halls, always giving you the once-over with their eyes. Occasionally they would lock eyes with you and try to stare you down. During orientation I was told never to look away, to stare them down as you would a stray dog. Looking away would be a sign of weakness. It may seem cruel, but you had to keep them beat down. You had to constantly remind them that you were in charge, that they were nothing. Anything less could lead to unrest and rebellion, and you couldn't have that. The mentals were up on the 9th floor. The elevators, like the doorways, were controlled by their guards and monitored by cameras. I would press a single wall button and eventually the doors would open. I step inside, look at the camera and speak my destination to the camera microphone. Sometimes there would be an inmate or 2 in the elevator. I never stood with my back to them. I would always stand facing them, my back to the door, staring them down, and for the most part they would lower their eyes to the floor and try not to look at me. I was instructed never to enter an elevator if it was occupied by an inmate that intimidated me, but I never backed down. At first I acted brave because I was unsettled but didn't want to show it. After a while, I felt sympathy for the men more so than the fear of them. The 9th floor was divided up into 5 pods, each containing 5 double occupancy cells. My habit was to rotate which pod I would visit on a daily basis, taking the weekends off. Even though I was educated not to make friends with the prisoners, I have to admit that I looked forward to the visits as much as they did. Sometimes heavily medicated and by far the calmest group of the men in the facility, they were, save for a few odd ducks, among the nicest people I had ever met. So it was day after day, week after week, month after month that I followed the same routine. There were occasional variances on some days due to fights or unrest among the inmates and general population, but one thing never changed. Every day, as I entered the block, I would look over at the door number 3 and wonder what lay behind it. I asked a few times and was always told the infirmary. After a while, stopping asking for fear that someone might become suspicious about why I cared so much. Truth was, I'm just a curious person. Once, I even asked another volunteer if there was a chance that I could get a tour of the infirmary, perhaps visit the men back there, but was told, with great firmness, that my request would be impossible to fulfill and that I should let the issue drop. I could almost hear the implied "or else" that just piqued my curiosity even more. My interest grew and grew until one day I decided that I was going to visit the infirmary, one way or another. Although my decision was made on a Tuesday, I didn't act immediately. I became more attentive to which guards were working on each day and at each time. Certain ones were more lax or friendlier. It took 2 weeks of studying them and building my confidence until I decided that it was time to act. Exactly 2 weeks and 1 day from Tuesday that I made my decision, I finally got up the courage to say, I'm visiting the infirmary today. In my mind, I thought, let's see what's behind door number 3, Monty. The guard never even batted an eye. Alright, Hutch, have fun, he said, twinkling his fingers as his eyes dropped back to the video camera screen in front of him. That easily, the door slid open. Boy, if the stench in general pot was bad, the odour wafting through door number 3 must have been quite literally 100 times worse. In the hot Texas sun, and with all of the turkey vultures, roadkill never lasted very long in Lubbock. Every once in a while, though, you'd come across a fresh one. That's the closest thing I could think of to describe the smell behind door number 3. It was as if you pick up a day-old dead armadillo, buried your nose in its crushed belly and took a deep breath. Well, what I imagine it would smell like. I had never actually done that. Definitely the smell of rotting meat and gangrene, though. The door slid shut, and another long hallway was revealed, dimly lit with flickering fluorescence. It was like something straight out of a horror movie. I soon found out that was an extremely appropriate description. Another door at the end of the hall hung loosely from its frame, allowing light to leak out around it. I could hear alternating moaning, crying, and the worst, screaming coming from behind the door. I should have turned around and headed back for the exit, but I had gotten too far. The only way to go was forward, and through the door. Although I knew it would seem suspicious, I opened the door slowly and stuck my head around the corner. The best way to seem as if you're being somewhere is to stride right in with confidence, but I couldn't. I was afraid of what might be behind the door. Heck, I thought it was most likely just a prison hospital, moaning, crying, screaming, all normal noises for men in pain. It was most definitely not a normal hospital ward. There were at least a dozen men strapped to steel tables, some naked, some in orange prison jumpsuits, and some wearing the striped suits like the trustees that I passed every day outside on the stairs. All of them had IVs inserted into their arms, the drip bags containing a fluid that looked like antifreeze. Vital sign monitors, or VSMs, were attached to most of them, and I could see by the displays that 2 of the men were clearly dead. There were 2 men and a woman, all wearing lab coats, standing amongst the tables. One of the male doctors looked up in surprise and then beckoned over. Come in, come in. They must have noticed the look of confusion, quickly turning to panic in my eyes. The female doctor began explaining in a soothing voice. Don't worry. You're not the first outsider to stumble his way into our infirmary, and I'm certain you won't be the last. As you've probably already guessed, what we have here is more of a lab than a hospital. We've just become so used to calling it the infirmary that it's simpler that way. She drew a breath and was about to continue with it when another of the doctors shouted, It's happening! Everyone, myself included, turned toward one of the tables that held a dead man. Well, previously held a dead man to be exact. His VSM had jumped to life, and seemingly so had he. He began twitching, and then thrashing, then he began to scream. I had seen a man being burned alive once, when a barrel of hot tar accidentally spilled on him, and the screaming was the same. It was gut-wrenching, and made my skin crawl. You could hear the pain and the sorrow in it. The female doctor scrambled to inject a syringe of some milky liquid into the man's IV port. After what seemed like an eternity, although it was probably mere seconds, he calmed, and his breathing steadied itself. Here's the thing. They had not been performing CPR on the man when I walked in. There was no defibrillator to be seen. The man was unmistakably dead when I arrived, and during the few minutes we had been talking, and here he was, alive once again, as if he had spontaneously resurrected. Disturbingly though, his eyes were still clouded over, as if he had cataracts. An uneasy and sick feeling crept its way into my belly. The doctors had not told me anything yet, but on the same level I already knew what was happening, or at least part of it. What's going on? So, While two of the doctors tended to the resurrected man, a third explained the experiment to me. You see, we were tasked to find out whether or not so-called evil men have souls or not, he began. Of course, I personally don't think that there is any such thing as true evil, but I do wonder if these malcontents have the same sort of spiritual makeup as the normal people. After all, why do they do what they do? In 1907, a Haven Hill, Massachusetts doctor by the name of Duncan McDougall managed, apparently overcoming any ethical reservations over human experimentation, to put 6 dying people on a bed equipped with sensitive springs, and claimed to have observed a sudden loss of weight, about 3/4 of an ounce, at the exact moment of their death. Having reasoned that such loss could not be explained by bowel movements or evaporation, he concluded he must have measured the weight of the soul. A follow-up experiment also showed that dogs didn't seem to suffer the same sort of loss. Therefore, they do not have souls. I'm not implying that these inmates are on the equivalence of dogs, but one must wonder exactly how they compare to normal, healthy human beings. We obviously do not have much control data, but we have recycled these men as much as possible for our research. It was there that I stopped him. Recycled? Oh yes, he brightened. We don't just throw them away. You see, as a pleasing consequence of our intended experiment, we found that we were able to revive our test subjects. Revive them? Yes, revive, resurrect, bring them back, whatever you wish to call it. This way, where we are able to take measurements and observe through a variety of different conditions, is quite ingenious. I really did not know what to say at that point. To question who authorized the experiment, what the ramifications were, how it worked. So I asked the first question that popped into my head. So, do they have souls? He removed a pencil from his breast pocket and tapped the side of his head, as if thinking it over. You know, I'm quite certain that they do. As I said, we lack enough data to use as a control. However, it seems that each time we bring them back, they lose a little until, it seems, it's all gone. After a certain point we can no longer observe any differences. And how long does that take? Usually 4 or 5 cycles. I cocked my head, still in disbelief over the casual way he was talking about the atrocities they were committing. And what happens then? I'm sorry, he said. I don't follow you. After done with them, what happens to them? Woo! He blew air through pursed lips. Yes, that's the problem, isn't it? That's currently the little snag we've run into. You see, eventually, they just stop dying. He must have seen the look on my face. I mean, it's not as if we haven't tried. We usually put them down in the most humane way. Sedation, paralysis, and eventually with an injection of enough potassium to stop their hearts. Then we revive them and do it again and again and again. Each time it gets a little more difficult to put them down until we just can't do it anymore. What? I was just about screaming. In simpler terms, they are basically incapable of dying. Quite a problem. And they were really starting to stink, he said. As if that were the chief problem. Can't you just burn them? Cremate the bodies? It was his turn to look at me in disgust. Oh, now that would be cruel. I held my head in my hands and began to hyperventilate. So where are they? Well, he said, outside, sweeping the steps. With that, I began to feel lightheaded. What caused me to faint, though, was his next question. Mr. He looked at my badge, then into my eyes. Hutchinson, would you consider yourself to be a good person? Do you believe that you have a soul? The Fear Experiment. In over 10 years of continuous travel, I have encountered many peculiar and fascinating individuals. Usually, the most interesting encounters are those with other travellers, men and women with no particular destination, or at least no destination they care to share. I like the idea that one can spend a fleeting event of a stranger in the middle of a foreign metropolis, only to wave goodbye the following day and never hear from them again. We are merely ships that pass in the night. As I contemplate modern technology, social media and the like, I fear the ships are becoming all too visible. The subtle nuances, silent expressions, and secrets that define us are now exposed to the prying spotlight of a lethargic civilization. So I look to places where secrets still exist, hidden nooks and passageways, the world beneath the disembodied voice of the many, the past, and thereby chance a friend. And I encountered an individual so out of touch with the modern world that he could have passed for a ghost. In what could very well have been his last year on this earth, he told us of a strange and profound experiment he was party to in his youth. A cold winter's morning. February 2008. Kaleti train station, Budapest, Hungary. The train bound for Timișoara, Romania, rolled in at around 11 a.m. If memory serves, its final destination was Bucharest. The train journey was estimated at 8 hours, so we were pretty sure we'd be spending the whole day on board. As well as the two of us, several others boarded. We located an empty compartment and stowed our luggage. Within 10 minutes the train was ready to depart. Upon doing so, the ticketing lady approached us almost immediately. I'll never forget the vacant look on her face as she studied my ticket. Some 5 or so minutes into the journey, an elderly gentleman clutching a brown leather briefcase opened the door to our compartment. He hovered in the doorway for several seconds before finally choosing to enter. Nodding in our direction, we responded in kind as he sat opposite us. His weathered face was chock full of gorged deep lines. My first thought was how unusual it was for an elderly gentleman to choose to join a pair of 20-somethings on a train that was particularly empty. It would soon be revealed, however, that we were precisely the kind of company he was looking for. The man, who I came to refer as Mr. Grey, sat in silence as he watched the world go by outside. My friend and I were idly gossiping, mostly about the things we had seen in Hungary and would undoubtedly see in Transylvania. Towards the end of our conversation, the man carefully opened the brown leather briefcase atop his lap and began to inspect the contents. Among a bundle of papers written in more than one language were a number of Soviet military orders, all of which looked weathered and tarnished, rather like the man himself. He looked down at the orders, and then back up at us, whispering in a thick Russian accent, "Tell me what you know of fear." The man from Tbilisi, 1920s, Georgia. Mr. Grey grew up in Tbilisi, Georgia in the 1920s. His father was a military figure and a great admirer of Joseph Stalin. He claimed to have been heavily brainwashed in his formative years, becoming a strong believer in the Soviet regime and communism in general. So when he approached adulthood, his heart was inevitably set on military service. Upon reaching the age of 18, he relocated to the Soviet Union, specifically Moscow. He rose to prominence as a young and dedicated officer with an increasing interest in the human condition. This he attributed to his commanding officer's interest in experimental psychology. Throughout the Second World War, Mr. Grey worked as a practicing psychologist in a Russian laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow. There he and his commanding officer, a man whom he had referred to as Mr. Red, conducted a variety of experiments on unwitting subjects. Often prisoners of war, although it wasn't unusual for volunteers to arrive at the laboratory, including would-be soldiers unfit for frontline warfare. Unsurprisingly, Mr. Grey's interest in this field grew exponentially after the end of the Second World War, and almost a decade later, during the height of the Cold War, he was conducting his own experiments. 1955, Kabala, Azerbaijan. For reasons undisclosed, Mr. Grey relocated to Kabala, Azerbaijan, and established a psychological research facility with a team of 7 medical practitioners. The team was assembled to conduct a highly controversial and secret experiment dubbed Project Sleep. For those of whom were involved, it would later come to be known as Project Fear. in their search for willing subjects. Villages in the neighbouring countries of Armenia, Russia, and Mr. Gray's native Georgia were systematically searched. Vague but intriguing advertisements were posted in strategic locations throughout small and often poor communities. Mr. Gray was carrying one of the advertisements in his briefcase, written in Georgian. He read the text aloud in broken English which, if translated, would have looked something like this on paper. Volunteers required. Civil servants. Medical research. Well paid. Support medical science. The applications poured in. 12 candidates were selected and subsequently invited to eligibility hearings. Of the 12 initially selected, 7 were formally invited to participate in Project Sleep. The experiment was to be conducted in 2 stages, though candidates would only be made aware of the first. Project Sleep, Stage 1. Candidates were to be kept awake for a period of 72 hours in solitary confinement to ensure their consciousness. Candidates were under constant supervision. Alarms were triggered remotely and repeatedly if candidates appeared to be falling asleep. Periodically, at the 24th, 48th and 72nd hours, candidates were asked to describe their worst fear. As each period passed, 3 out of the 7 candidates exaggerated their fear they had initially described. For example, candidate number 2 had initially described a genetic fear of crustaceans, specifically woodlice. Upon questioning at the 72nd hour, his fear were not only of woodlice, but the possibility his closest friends and family members would eventually mutate into woodlice. The 48th hour brought about strange, dark fears for candidates 3 and 5, fears that greatly worried the practitioners. Unsurprisingly though, the 72nd hour instilled a heightened sense of anxiety and paranoia in all 7 candidates, though it was specifically noted that candidate 5 was said to be experiencing severe apathetic gloom. And then it was on to stage 2. Intermission, train compartment. Even the notion of describing stage 2 filled Mr. Gray with visible unease. He was sweating and clutching haphazardly at tattered bits of paper. I recall with perfect clarity the moment Mr. Gray withdrew a handkerchief and slowly wiped his brow. His motion was pained and unsteady, but in that instant I could have sworn his obscured mouth was grinning. Project Sleep, Stage 2. Upon completion of the 72nd hour, each candidate was permitted to sleep. In fact, they were given a sleeping agent which ensured they would not be aware of what was to follow. All candidates were driven to a secret facility in the mountains, somewhere outside Kabbalah. The team referred to it secretly as the Mansion. The sleeping candidates were strategically placed in various locations throughout the complex and were left to awaken naturally. The team allotted 24 hours for them to remain inside. The facility was locked from the outside and metal panels were used to seal the windows. No surveillance equipment was used. They would rely purely upon the candidate's statements upon release at the end of the time period. It is interesting to note that according to Mr. Gray there was nothing particularly unusual about the facility, other than its convenient isolated location. Results. Upon completion of the 24th hour, the mansion's heavy doors were opened. There Mr. Gray and his team discovered 2 emaciated candidates, numbers 5 and 7. Following the first sweep of the facility, the remaining candidates were nowhere to be found, though bizarre evidence to suggest they encountered unspeakable things was everywhere. Candidate 5 was comatose and as such was placed under surveillance. Candidate 7, however, was surprisingly calm and coherent. He described an experience unlike anything any member of the team had heard of before. It began with him waking in a quiet room, one eerily similar to his bedroom at home in Armenia, and hearing strange sounds, including the fearful cries of unfamiliar voices. Approximately 10 minutes elapsed before a stranger burst into his room shouting manically, alluding to an insect of giant proportions pursuing him throughout dilapidated maze-like corridors. Ready to dismiss the stranger's story as nonsense, he became aware of a distant humming or buzzing sound. Some inexplicable winged creature was on the prowl, tirelessly searching for a victim to fulfill its unknowing desires. The stranger left the room amid uncontainable shrieks and disappeared into the darkness of a gloomy corridor. The buzzing sound continued for a while until Seven heard what he could only describe as a blood-curdling scream. Seven exited the room only to discover thick, coarse hairs strewn about the corridor, accompanied by sporadic pools of an unidentifiable viscous fluid. Mr. Gray and his team referred to the notes made during Stage 1 with Candidate 7. He repeatedly described a fear of helplessness, a fear that had remained consistent even after sleep deprivation. And so, throughout Stage 2, as he wandered throughout the mansion, he continued to experience circumstances beyond his control. He described labyrinthian corridors surrounding him that seemed to grow in height as he explored them. Doors seemed to move away from him, and his attempts to open them had failed. He repeatedly came upon dead ends beyond which he heard manic voices, giving rise to the notion that the owners of those voices were being pursued. In the end, it was nothing more than blind luck that led Candidate 7 to the exit, and up until the moment the doors were opened, he had believed he was slouched against a cold brick wall rather than a set of perfectly ordinary oak doors. Mr. Gray's discoveries within the facility were both fascinating and horrifying. In what appeared to be confirmation of the presence of a large crustacean, the team discovered a giant exoskeleton, complete with a number of jointed limbs, and although it was retrieved for further analysis, it inexplicably disappeared from the safe storage several days later. Puddles and coagulated blood were also discovered, supporting the idea that something malevolent had been wandering the halls, and furthermore, that something or someone had been injured. Intermission. Train compartment. With me. Mr. Gray looked at my friend and me with cold, vacant eyes. The experiment was a success, he said in a thick Russian accent, although now I wish it hadn't been so. Once again he reached into his briefcase and produced a bundle of papers. Further results, 1956. Undisclosed location, Azerbaijan. Candidate 5 spent almost 6 months in a coma, and had been under constant medical supervision in an undisclosed location, where the team had hoped he would eventually recover. Much to their relief, he awoke on February 23rd, 1956. Several days passed before he felt well enough to discuss the events. The middle-aged Azerbaijani librarian disturbed Mr. Gray and his team of practitioners with his account, so much so that all plans for subsequent experiments were abandoned. Mr. Gray recalled the librarian's unique fear as described in Stage 1, the fear that human beings were vessels for a single greater entity, a being with one desire, to compartmentalize itself into a theoretically infinite number of finite individuals. The fear intensified as the time periods passed, with number 5 describing the entity as present in mammals, birds and fish, but more worryingly, present in all human beings, living and dead. An entity that took the form of an absolutely everything capable of breath in an endless attempt to escape the truth of itself as an impossibly lonely, omnipotent being. Candidate 5's conclusion and ultimate fear was that he too was an aspect of this faceless mass of a thing, and that in a universe of infinite possibilities he would be forced to live every single inconceivably horrible life imaginable from the start to finish, over and over again, forever. In line with Project Sleep, deep within walls of the mansion, this all-consuming fear came alive, and as it did, almost instantaneously Candidate 5 saw through the eyes of the other candidates. He saw their fears and lived them. He watched as they fled from untold horrors and screamed each of their screams. His mind wandered further still, deep into the strange, half-imagined minds of the creatures, made flesh by the candidates and their fears. He felt things only monsters were supposed to feel, and merged them with emotions unthinkable to man. And as this hapless wandering consumed him, his mind began to collapse, almost as though the matter in which he was made was coming apart, torn asunder by the unseen forces of an exotic dimension, a place where only fear, pain and agonizing confusion could exist. And there he stayed for almost 6 months. Candidate 5 addressed Mr. Gray and his team, telling them of their fates, explaining the intricate invisible tapestry blinding each and every one of them together, regurgitating memories, thoughts, hopes and dreams from the deepest and darkest recesses of their minds. And what Mr. Gray described as almost an eternity of outpouring, the Azerbaijani librarian returned to that deep, dark coma the team had found him in following the experiment. Train compartment. And so Mr. Gray's conclusion was ironic. In what was supposed to be an experiment designed to study the depths of fear, he and his team of practitioners summoned what can only be described as a man's deepest fear, the fear that one day he may know himself. I asked what he meant by that. He said simply, "Your question is proof that we aren't quite there yet." Mr. Gray closed his eyes and slept. As the Carpathian Mountains rolled by the compartment window, I thought about the being and the frightening possibility that Mr. Gray himself and even my friend and I, on a quiet train rolling through Eastern Europe, could be nothing more than aspects of an unknowable, omnipotent creature. We reached our destination. Mr. Gray remained asleep. I took his photograph. A part of me wants to visit Gabala, Azerbaijan, to seek out the old facility in the mountains nearby. Will it be there? If the experiment truly was a success, shouldn't whatever was summoned still be there?